Hey Reza, it's time to have some more hot tech topics. And today, I think we'd like to talk really about some speaker coverage and design work. I know you've been doing a lot of that work for us, a Bluesound professional, and maybe you could, I had some thoughts about trying to put a Bluesound professional system into a restaurant I had in mind. Maybe you give me some insights if I come to you and say, hey, I want to have figure out how many speakers I need and the design, and I just say, hey, here's I want to put it in this restaurant, and here's the floor plan. Is that enough information to go on, or what do you need to work with?
No, it's a good question because there's so many variables that are at play in a case like that. In terms of, let's say, a restaurant, you might have, it could be anything from open ceilings, high ceilings, drywall ceilings, drop ceilings, and all that could dictate what speakers we choose if you do choose a ceiling speaker. I've seen someone who had a restaurant, and so it used to be a warehouse pretty much. So the ceilings were so high, in their case, ceiling speakers didn't make sense. So we went with on wall. But then in cases where you can use ceiling speakers, it's definitely a good option because of the coverage, the dispersion. Um, the sound's not necessarily centralized to one side. It spreads a lot better. So, sometimes you may have a floor plan, but if it doesn't give the information, for example, like ceiling height,
And
proper
that can
scale.
change things in terms of maybe I could use a pendant solution, right? So I
Correct.
could use my in-ceiling speakers from Bluesound Professional, but I could mount them in a pendant housing and still utilize that and stay off the walls. But
Bring them lower.
because I've told you now what my ceilings look like, maybe
Exactly.
that comes into play because the ceiling's 25 feet high.
Exactly. For an example like that, yeah, it might be 25 feet high. You might be able to extend them down 10 feet. So then, the speakers are about 15 feet. And that makes a big difference. And, it's funny you talk about the different heights. That's a big one too. A lot of times people would assume that if the ceiling's closer to you, for example, like let's say a 10-foot ceiling versus a 15 or 18-foot ceiling, you'll need more speakers in the higher ceiling. But what we find is that the higher you go, there's a threshold, of course, but the higher you go, the more coverage you get. So, for example, in 18 feet, one speaker will have a much larger degree of coverage than if it was mounted at, say, 10 feet. So, in a case like the 18 feet, you might be able to get away with less speakers, but each speaker might play at a higher volume.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I have, if I haven't told you about my restaurant is what kind of SPL level am I looking for,
That's the
right? I
thing,
think
yeah.
a lot of us really don't know whether it's a true background music or something more in the foreground, and that has a bearing too, doesn't it?
Of
In
course.
terms of, if the speaker's 18 feet high, I might have to turn the volume up more. If it's 10 feet high, it's going to be focused and closer to me. So those all change the coverage and really how many speakers I need in my space.
For sure, and I like to ask people if they have an idea of what the ambient noise might be like. I think that's a good way to
Oh,
tackle
that's
it.
true.
So if it's like, let's say, like a sports bar versus fine dining restaurant, it's going to have a different general level of noise in terms of people how they speak and the overall noise you're competing with. So, for example, if it's somewhere that's going to be very noisy, you will need more speakers or higher volume just to compete with that ambient noise that's there. So I think knowing the venue, being able to anticipate things like that helps as well. The good thing about our speakers is they're very scalable and manageable in the sense that you're not tied to one setting. You can easily in the app turn set volume levels individually or set it as a whole. So you're not really tied to, say, for example, you have a certain trivia night that's the music needs to be low or off, versus another night where you want it loud, like a family dinner night or something like that. You're not tied to one volume or one configuration. It's very easy to change on the spot, add, decrease, and things like that.
And I think a lot of times too, the solution that you may design for users, like if I had a restaurant, it might be tied to quality. We have different ways of delivering music to a space. We have low impedance speakers, we have constant voltage speakers, we have PoE speakers, all have different levels of quality. At Bluesound Professional, we try and promote quality sound in that space. And certainly from the PoE perspective, we can deliver that, and also from low impedance speakers that we have, deliver that. But it's interesting, constant voltage, that still creeps in where people want that. We do offer that as a solution. It's sort of the sound's a little different, maybe great more for a foyer, a lobby or something like that. But in some circumstances, constant voltage is a possibility.
Yeah.
I guess you have to sort of determine and work with the customer in terms of what they're looking for in terms of sound quality.
100%. I think it's a comfort thing too, for maybe where people are a little used to it. There are limitations, like you mentioned, fidelity. You do lose a lot of that bottom end. Also, what people don't always think about, people tend to think that it's kind of a myth that with constant voltage you could put unlimited speakers on a given amp, when really, you should be looking at the overall wattage. So I had a case where someone used it. It wasn't Bluesound. They moved to Bluesound, but their initial installation was a 70 volt constant, and they kind of misspec'd their amp. So they had a certain amount of speakers, and in order for the amp to be compatible and not overheat, each speaker ended up being tapped at, I think it was 3 watts.
Oh, wow.
So then they were like, oh, the speakers don't sound that good. And, kind of had to explain in that case,
Yeah, I've tested, and, when you get down certainly below 15 watt tap, 10 watt tap, then it starts becoming kind of anemic.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one thing that the PoE solution takes away. You're not worrying about tapping. You're not worrying about things like that. Every speaker is getting its full power, and you can manage it after the fact. It's not like you have to go up to the physical amplifier and turn a gain or a pot or something. It's right in the app, and you can manage. So I think for that flexibility, that helps a lot. And then, that brings us to zoning, which is another thing,
So a lot of your designs, they give you a floor plan and they say, hey, I got a restaurant, a bar, a patio or whatever. Then you have some decisions. You've got to ask me, do I want all those 3 areas to be together, to be grouped together, or to be possibly separate at times? And then all that configuration, some of it might be outdoors in the patio.
Exactly.
And what do I use for that? So you have to be told all that information, right? So you sort of developed a questionnaire or something like
100%,
that.
100%, and we can link to that also, because I think the more information we have, the better solution we can design. Again, like you alluded to, we're big on sound quality. We're not satisfied with good enough, and just having, that typical sort of, I guess, paging system sound. It is musical, and in order for us to know that, we need to know as much about the venue. Location matters.
Because I think time and time again, we give you a floor plan and say that's it, and it's not to scale or the scale on there. It's some PDF that's reduced from a blueprint. You have no idea what the room dimensions are. You don't know the ceiling height. You don't know the music the levels that are there. You don't, as you mentioned, the ambient noise. You have no idea. Like, there's a lot of things that could come into play that could change your decision as to what you need for coverage and design.
For sure. And I think one of the main things I would say is, if there's information that's not known, for example, let's say it's a new build versus an existing, it's best to work together, if there's multiple teams, or if it's a new project and there's the design team, there is maybe, like the construction team, as much people that can come together and help it. I think it's important. It shouldn't be an afterthought, because it's part of just the way you would plan the lighting, something like that. You get everyone needed on the table, whether it's
I
electrician.
mean, do you see from time to time, like if it's a retrofit, do you see like images of what the facility looks like? And maybe in a new build that's not available, but maybe there's some design architecture drawings of what that space is going to look like. Wouldn't that help?
It definitely helps, and you know, retrofits can be different because sometimes, you know, you might be facing a heritage building, or you know, somewhere where they simply don't want to, you know, go into the ceiling or things like that. So that can help dictate the solution. We can always offer the best suggestion technically, but also work around whatever confines you might have, or any limitations or things like that. So there's a lot of flexibility when you look through the whole lineup of products. So
yeah, when I look through our lineup of products and I see there is a lot of flexibility, and sometimes that's confusing, but that's why, you know, someone like you, Reza, can help out. Because then I look at my restaurant and I could say, well, I could do that with everything from a central closet running to speakers in that space, or I could use PoE speakers, or I could use constant voltage speakers, or I could use multiple combination zoning amplifiers and groups of speakers. My outdoor patio, I could use some of our waterproof IP speakers via PoE. Lots of different ways. And sometimes that's confusing. That's why I look to you for resource on this, because I'm really happy, Reza, that you're here helping on those, because it can take a lot of time to figure out the best solution. And as I say, we work through some of these points in terms of what information you need. You can give a better recommendation.
For sure. And like we said, the more information we have, the better we can be at coming up with a design. One of the things I also want to talk about was zoning. We talked about that briefly, and a lot of times when you think of zoning, let's say in a 70-volt context, a lot of people more just thought, okay, I can control the volume in each zone, and that was the definition of a zone. But with Bluesound Professional, a zone can also mean separate music in each zone, separate, or not just music, audio, whatever you feed it. So for example, if you're using something like the 300 here, that's everything all in one, and that could receive a separate feed other than another, you know, 300 in another room. So in zones by Bluesound Pro definition is independent stream and also independent volume.
Yeah, and the neat flexibility we have, we can group those zones all together and play the same for some big party. Or as you say, out on my outdoor patio from my restaurant, I could be playing completely different music than in the restaurant, because, you know, physically they're separated, so there won't be any interference on sound, but I could have, because they're capable of it, completely different streams.
Yep, and we had something like that where someone had a room with a divisible wall, and they wanted to be able to separate it that way.
That's almost like a traditional ballroom thing, you know, where you have this big ballroom and then yet you have three smaller wedding venues or whatever, and you have these big curtains that come down and divide that huge ballroom now into three separate venues. The ability of our units to, as you say, from zoning, and now I can break up that one main group and break it up into three different groups and independently operate those three groups, and each group can have their own music. And without having to switch wires around, I don't go up in the ceiling, I don't go anywhere. It's all done from the app. I either group things or ungroup things. I run streams in zone A, B, or C. Is kind of a neat concept, because the old days I had to go to a patch board, I had to switch speakers around or whatever, or I just couldn't do it.
Or even traditionally, you know, it was a very pricey solution if you wanted to automate something like that with separate DSPs and control processors and you know, so to be able to do it so easily, and on top of that, reconfigure it as needed. So if one day you realize, hey, you know, I'm not going to have three rooms, I'm going to make it one small room two big rooms, you know, combine those other two,
Yeah.
we can reprogram. Well,
Right.
even the end user
the
can
end
do
user
that.
can do it.
Yeah.
I think that's a key thing. You know, you look at some of these control platforms, and I need to call in some control
Exactly.
programmer to come in and redo the control and what's talking to what. And as you
Exactly.
say, the ability of the user just to easily group or ungroup devices within seconds is really a novel concept.
Yeah, and definitely, and that shows the advantage of the PO speakers. And like we said too, you know, the options like that are available if you did have to, for some reason, use a traditional constant voltage or low impedance setup with, you know,
Right.
something
So I
like the
mean,
B40.
yet again, that's just another point that you need to be told in terms of doing speaker coverage and design, especially on the design side, right? In terms of, is this kind of thing going to happen? Are there like little party rooms, and are they going to be listening to their own streams and whatever? And so that's kind of interesting. So what's been your most difficult design to date?
Well,
And maybe why it was difficult.
exactly. And when you say difficult, it could be two ways. It could be difficult in terms of requirements or integration, maybe with, you know, traditional systems, or it could be difficult because simply not having the information needed. And you know, that's a different kind of difficult.
Yeah.
That's when you're literally just guessing.
I
So
think
for
that's what you're
example,
faced with the most, though,
yeah,
isn't it?
that kind of
Lack of
difficult,
information and
yeah, and I think, you know, everyone, like we said, can benefit from more information. And I think once you have all the information, that's when you can execute the best design and, you know, set expectations, meet expectations, and make sure everyone's happy. You know, I personally, and I know you're the same way, you don't want to be guessing. We want to be able to issue the best design possible and be confident in that design, where, you know, if there's uncertainty, you're you know, you don't want to have any sort of doubt, and the best way for that is to have all the information. And I think you know, it, like we said, it matters in the sense that I use the analogy of, say, something like lighting. You know, you make sure and you get who's needed on that. Like, for example, you know, designer, electrician, and, you know, whoever else to help assess something like lighting. The audio is no different. It is important. It sets the tone. It's valuable. So I think that spending the time on it is something that is worth doing because of the end result.
yeah. I mean, one thing too, I think in a lot of what you have available to you in the design side is, you know, you're going to say X number of speakers in this space will work. And if someone at the last second, you know, after it goes in says, you know, could do with one or two more speakers. You know, the neat thing is when we're using even the PoE solutions, pretty easy to add those one or two, right? So not to be a cop-out saying, hey, you know, you need to stick with the design, but if you did miss something, and if our integrators miss something, it's easy to change. And the other change that's quite easy to do is if something wasn't understood about the ceiling and you really needed a pendant rather than an in-ceiling, the neat thing is that our in-ceiling speakers, we can modify them with a pendant kit and convert the in-ceiling speaker into a pendant unit. And so there's no loss of cost there. It's not like a completely separate unit. Now I've got this in-ceiling unit I can't use. We get to be able to use everything, and so there's no waste of money. So that flexibility in terms of the design approach really does help, because I don't think everyone can design something perfectly, right? I know I can't. Maybe you can, Reza, but you know, I don't know.
There's always room, you know, for improvement, room for error. Fortunately, like you said, you know, it may be surprises for everyone. Like, that's just how I think building things or construction works. You know, you never know. You take down a wall, you never know what's behind it, you know? So
some things could happen, especially in retrofit, right? Or even new build. Someone makes a last minute change to the design, but they didn't advise the AV design. And so all of a sudden someone's got to make a last minute change,
for sure,
right?
Yeah, there's compromise, you know, like everyone needs to be happy, you know, the designer may have an idea of what they want something to look like. And, you know, you might think, hey, you know, put these pendant speakers, but they might say, no, that needs to be, empty, that needs to be nice and clean looking. So you work together. Definitely, it's a collaborative thing, and we're always willing to collaborate and make sure everyone's happy, because that's key, especially when it's a new build or a retrofit. You're always working around things, you're working around preferences, and you want to make sure that you address all the different variables that can arise.
One thing I learned when we were designing our in-ceiling speakers is just the phenomenal coverage it's capable of, and the fact that when you have a tweeter and a woofer in the design, that tweeter is the device that really provides that coverage, and so when we talk about the coverage area, it's tremendous. It's like 140, 150 degrees, somewhere around there. Really even more, I think. Yeah. And so it's amazing how you could, if you wanted, space those out quite a bit. And compared to some, you'll see some in-ceiling speakers that are basically just a woofer and that's it. And from those, you don't have the same coverage.
Not at all.
And so we're really excited with the in-ceiling solutions, and certainly makes your life a lot easier, because I think no matter how you design, it's hard to mess up, if you will, right? Because it sounds so good. It sounds so good over such a great area.
Yeah, it's true.
That if you don't have the same blank spots that you would in some other in-ceiling speakers.
100%, and I think that, like we mentioned before, the fidelity of it really, really helps to maximize the coverage, the space. And if you really wanted to, there's always sometimes budget constraints, right? So, for example, someone came to me and they said, I want to know sort of the ideal technical, perfect scenario of speakers, but also this is my budget. And
we talked about that the other day, right? Said, okay, here's the correct technical solution, but if the financial concerns come into play, then all of a sudden those 10 speakers become 6. And you say, technically, you came to me with some specs and you thought for my restaurant that's going to work, but now you say, well, I can only afford 6. I guess the other neat thing is, okay, you can put 6 in, see how it sounds. If you need to put more in, you can do that after the fact, right? Maybe the next budget year you can put more in, or you have that flexibility. But as you say, there's a lot of times like
you're not sure, and that goes back to what you were mentioning about just a simple floor plan enough. If you have more information into what the space is going to look like, let's say for a restaurant, and there's a counter on the upper right corner, and then tables at the bottom, and the budget is limited, that will help us know where we can put those speakers, right? It may not make sense. You might not need it in, if there's sort of like an open kind of hallway area, maybe you might concentrate them where people might be sitting, or things like that. So a lot of the more information we have, again, in terms of the overall layout, how it's going to look, what the flow of people are going to be, if it's a retail solution, all those things we factor in, and that can help us to make the best design.
We've talked about background audio levels and required SPL audio levels.
Correct.
Is there any other criteria that you can think of that's kind of important to know up front, or would be good to know up front?
In terms of like
for your design,
for the design, I think it would just be maybe in current infrastructure. Is there any current wiring? Let's say they're looking to leverage wiring they have, or let's say for example, I've seen one design where they didn't realize they had network drops in all the rooms, and that actually saved them money, because they were thinking they'd have to run wire,
right.
And we're like, no, the POV solution, and they're like, but we don't have power. It's like, no, literally it's power data all in one.
We'll talk about more of that in the PoE solution, but when you've got the Ethernet cable, some people need to understand that power over Ethernet allows you to deliver both in one cable.
And then they were impressed by the results, because it was new to them. And when they heard how it sounded, they couldn't believe it. So I like stories like that. So
that's where your initial design sort of scared them a little bit, but when they realized what they had in their infrastructure, then all of a sudden it
Yeah.
came together, and then the result worked out.
Yeah, so let us know like distances. For example, if something is far away, all those things can help. Also, I would say as much information, if you can fill out the form that we made, that would always be helpful. And we're always easily accessible in the sense that if something changes, you can let us know. It doesn't mean that if you fill out that form that's set in stone, and we're willing, to collaborate. If you want to jump on a meeting with us and someone else from the project, we can all work together and kind of iron everything out.
Sort of in maximum sites, like I guess some of the designs you're called upon is maybe just like a small restaurant or some quick serve restaurant where we literally use maybe just a couple speakers and that's it. I don't know how many times, Reza, you get called on to do any coverage or design for small sites, or is it mostly larger ones that you get involved with?
So it's kind of across the board. I think a lot of times people are looking for guidance. So we've seen people, with a retail store that fits a few people, all the way to, a corporate space that has lobbies on 10 floors that need audio. So it's been a mixed bag. And we see.
So some of those retail stores, like you getting 30, 40, 50 speakers, or?
Well, it depends. So there might be a small clothing store, there might be a grocery store. So for example, a big grocery store, you might see about that much, 30, 40. Right. Whereas a smaller retail store might be, 4 speakers and maybe a couple subs if they want it.
I was going to ask you about subwoofers. Do you get called much for adding subwoofers in some of these spaces?
We do. A lot of people at first are not sure if they would need it, or they might think it's overkill because they're thinking subwoofer, they're thinking kind of like their home theater subwoofer, like a concert subwoofer or something. And we kind of tell them, it really just kind of rounds it out a bit, especially if you're using a 70-volt solution, you're losing that bottom end. So it helps give you that extra sound. And people are happy with it because our subs, it's a very smooth, tight bass. It's not rumbly, it's not loud, and it blends in well. And that's something, in the app you have control over the crossover points of volume, so you can tailor it to your space. It's not like, it's going to just be out of
right,
place.
And our subwoofer units kind of, it doesn't really stick out as a big box in the space. So you mount it on the wall or underneath the counter or something like that.
Yeah,
so
it's so
kinda
slim, yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of helpful.
Yeah.
I know I've seen some retail spaces that have this huge subwoofer hanging in the ceiling, and I get kind of scared when I walk under it. But I guess we have different ways of mounting around the perimeter in that are probably a little safer.
Exactly. And lower frequencies has a way of sort of traveling and kind of moving around objects. Yeah. So you don't have to be as worried with the placement as you would of, like your top end speaker. So it could be mounted, kind of hidden. We do that a lot, or sometimes a bit in a corner and kind of leverage that corner to sort of amplify its sound a bit. But overall, I like what I was impressed by is just the sound of it and how smooth it is. It's very pleasant. It's not.
Which kind of design do you like better? Do you like a centralized solution, so a whole rack of equipment in a closet buried somewhere, going out to speakers in a space, or do you like a decentralized kind of solution where every speaker is its own zone and you can do whatever you want with those? Like, I don't want to give away, but
yeah,
I mean, what from a design perspective, which kind of system do you kind of prefer?
Yeah, and it's funny you say that, because I remember where there was a time where centralization was like this big thing, where that was it's like kind of, I guess, for lack of a better term, selling point, because if something was decentralized, you didn't have control. But the thing is, when we say decentralized, some people might you know, if you're thinking traditionally, you might think it has a negative connotation to it, but it doesn't. It's decentralized in the sense that you don't need this big rack, but yet you still have central
control.
Yeah, and you know, so that's something that's always you have to sort of clarify, because sometimes people might be like, well, don't you want centralization? It's like, it is centralized from a control aspect, from a usability aspect, but you don't need a whole room dedicated to amps and processors anymore. It's literally, you know, a switch, which you'll have anyways, because, you know, everywhere has internet,
right,
or a network. So it definitely, you know, the PoE's decentralized solution, that's the future for sure.
So look forward to our next Surroundscapes presentation, where we'll talk about PoE speakers. That's kind of my favorite topic, and something that's dear to my heart, because we really have created that space.
Yes, correct.
And so we get into that. I know, you know, some of your design cues and coverage cues will come into place with that, because all the flexibility that gives you. But looking forward to that one. And it was fun today talking about coverage and design. I'm glad that you have to deal with that day in, day out. But I certainly, you know, it's always been a fascinating topic.
For sure.
Thanks.
And,